Welcome, everyone, to the Unlearn the Lies About Mental Health podcast. I am super excited about this conversation. I'm really excited for those of you who are joining live on YouTube. If you are joining live on Facebook, do me a favor and share this. We're going to have an amazing conversation today talking about peer support. We're going to talk about peer support, how we can implement peer support, how easy it is to implement peer support. And we have a phenomenal guest to introduce to our audience here during the Unlearn the Lies About Mental Health podcast. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce myself and we're going to dive right into the conversation. All right, so my name is Abraham Sculley. Today I'm going to be your host of the Unlearn the Lies About Mental Health podcast. This is the podcast for young adults and leaders in education wanting to learn how to create safe spaces for honest dialogue about mental health. This particular episode is very special, personally for me, because I have been impacted by peer support and just what it is to have friends, family members who actually care enough to reach out. But then also professionally in the work that I do, that we do here at Speaks to Inspire. This podcast is powered and sponsored by Speaks to Inspire. There's a lot of conversation surrounding peer support. How do we implement peer support? How do we encourage peer support? So in this episode, we're going to be talking about peer support and how to create these safe spaces. Again, we also have a special guest who's going to share his story and how he is putting peer support in the pockets of millions of people around the world, like literally peer support in your pocket. All right, so I'm super excited about this conversation. Just a quick message from our sponsor. This podcast is sponsored by Speaks to Inspire, the mental health solution for young adults suffering in silence. Speaks to Inspire is creating safe spaces for students across the nation through comprehensive programs that decrease the stigma of prioritizing mental health and well-being. You can learn more about how your campus can benefit from partnering with Speaks to Inspire by visiting www.speakstoinspire.com. At this time, I see that we have our guest in the building, and I'm excited to introduce to you all Johnny Crowder, and the crowd goes wild. How are you, sir?
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. How's your day so far?
Well, there's a lot of things to be thankful for. I got to have watermelon. So that's a huge plus. It's watermelon season. Okay. And also, I had to do a photo shoot outside, and I thought I was going to bake in the sun, but it only took 10 minutes and we were in the shade. So already off the top of my head, I got a few things to be thankful for.
I love it. That's awesome. That's awesome. So we're really excited to have you on the podcast. As you heard me share a little bit in the introduction, what we focus on and who this is targeted toward. So we really want to support young leaders. We want to support staff and faculty in education because everyone needs to know, how do we create these safe spaces for young adults when it comes to these types of conversations about mental health. And you've done an incredible job just really taking an idea, right? A vision and bringing it to reality. I think as a creative myself, that there's a process in that. So a lot of our audience, they may not know who you are. They may have heard of Cope Notes. They probably have Cope Notes on their phone right now. But I'd love for you to take a few minutes and just introduce yourself to our audience.
Yeah, my name is Johnny Crowder, and I love peer support. Obviously, that's why I'm joining you for this particular conversation. But the short version of my background is I grew up with a bunch of different mental health conditions. I didn't want to go to treatment for a long time. I wound up going to treatment eventually. It helped me a lot, but I faced a lot of challenges while I was in treatment. peer support made a huge impact on my recovery. And I went to school for psych, started learning about how the brain works, and got really interested in seeing like how I could teach my brain to think differently. And now I get to do a lot of public speaking about mental health, and I get to play music that talks about mental health in the lyrics. And I also get to run Cope Notes, which we provide daily mental health support for people all over the world. And I just care so much about making peer support accessible. So I'm excited to join you for a conversation about exactly that.
I love it. And I do want to dive into your story a little bit more. I'll save it. I'll save the juicy parts to the middle of this conversation just to hear a little bit more about you. I had an opportunity to hear you speak actually virtually, and I heard bits and pieces of your story. And as someone who has struggled with mental health challenges for a season of my life as well, I understand that there's a lot of depth, right? And as being a public speaker and having these presentations, there's only so much that you can actually share because there's so much in your story. So I definitely want to dive into the meaty parts of that as well. But before we get into that, we are talking about creating safe spaces, right? We're talking about peer support and how do we set the environment? How do we set or create a safe space for dialogue around mental health? So I actually just wanted to start it off with a question, right? Like, what does the word safe space mean to you, Johnny?
The things that come to mind are probably if I share something vulnerable, people won't stare at me like, wow, that was a little too real. Like if I'm sharing in a safe space, I should feel like anything that I say is kind of fair game. I don't want to be treated like I'm sick, like I'm some crazy person when I share that stuff. And then also, I'm hoping at that same time that if I'm sharing in that environment, that there's not going to be like huge implications for how I'm treated outside of that space. So let's say if I say in a safe space, I get really depressed on the weekends because I'm not around people as much. And let's say hypothetically, I eat a gallon of ice cream every weekend because it's something that I use to self-soothe. I sure as heck don't want the person on the other end of that conversation to go, what? That's disgusting. That's crazy. But I also, when I leave that environment, don't want that. Let's say if someone did respond negatively, I don't want that to follow me outside of the space. So I think inside of a safe space, it's important for that safety to exist, but it's just as important that when you leave that space, that whatever you say doesn't then follow and haunt you through stigma.
I love it. And that's such a critical point. I think when we think about cultivating, creating these safe spaces, it's really about coming to the core of who we are as human beings. Like, what do we need as human beings? And I think one of the biggest things is connection. And if we don't have that safe space, if we don't feel like we can open up, if we can be honest, then there is no real connection, right? So it's not as difficult as sometimes it's made to be. It's really about, okay, as a human being, right? What do I need as a human being to feel connection? And it is, sharing, being vulnerable and not being judged, right? So I think a lot of that has to do with what I think about the word safe space mean for me as well. Is just, that space where, you can be, I like to share this acronym. It's being hot, right? I call it my hot principle, being honest, open, and transparent. So a safe space for me is an environment where I can be honest with myself. I can be open to sharing and being exposed to new ideas, and I can just transparently show up as my authentic self, right? And like you mentioned, Johnny, like leave that space and know that whatever we discuss, right, it's cool. Like it's a part of what we experience in life. So I love that
Do you ever
shared.
listen to Pastor Mike Todd?
Yeah, I used to listen to his stuff. Yeah, I've heard him share that as well.
Oh yeah, he says we're a hot church. I'm like, let's
Yeah,
go.
yeah,
That's
it's
awesome.
awesome. Yeah. So that kind of leads into the next part of it, because when I think these words safe space, it gets thrown around a lot, and sometimes, like I mentioned earlier, it's almost as if it's harder than it really is to create a safe space. But if we can make it extremely practical, I came up with just three things that we can think about and implement to help facilitate these safe spaces, and I want to hear your opinion and your thoughts on these. So the first thing is, and again, we're talking about young adults, we're talking about students, right? The first part is asking students, like, what do you want? What do you need? Versus having this idea of what is needed and implementing something that probably doesn't work. And it may have worked 2 years ago, but right, but like now we're speaking to, you know, a different group of students, right? And so simply starting by, hey, just asking them, hey, what do you need? Like, what would you like to see more of? What do you want? What would be helpful for you? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. What, you have anything to add or any thoughts on that, Johnny?
Yeah, I'm getting a I'm finishing my peer support specialist certification, or my peer recovery specialist certification, and as part of that you have to like watch these sessions and then take notes on them, like group sessions. And what I'm noticing is there's kind of a trend of someone who's a group leader going around and asking everybody what they expect to receive from the session. And I'm like, ooh, that's interesting, because of course there are the basic things that you would figure everyone would kind of more or less want, like, okay, I want to feel respected in this space, or I want there to be confidentiality, mutual confidentiality and stuff like that. But then it also allows individual people to say, I'm expecting, one person in one of the videos said, I'm expecting my cultural heritage to be respected here, because I wear a headdress. My family wears a headdress. It's a big part of our culture. And I don't want this to be some weird thing in the group where it's like I'm treated differently because I'm dressed this way. And I was like, man, like how cool is it to have, and everyone in the group was like, yeah, sounds good. Totally doable. And it was like a really cool thing to watch, because you don't get something that specific if you try to, like you said, do the same group rules as 2 years ago. Now you do need the same rules like confidentiality and mutual respect and stuff like that. But just going around and asking for a sentence from each person there, like, what are you expecting to see here? What are you hoping to get out of it? And having that little opportunity for them to share, it might be supporting an existing rule like respect or confidentiality, but it might be something totally off the wall. And for that specific group of people, you can incorporate that, and it's not something that you would have thought of on your own.
100%. I love it. And that actually ties into the next point, which is including student voices in the conversation and surrounding whatever initiatives are being implemented, right? So, like, how can we do that? So, one of the things that we do at Speaks to Inspire, we host a lot of events for campuses, right? So we can do movie screenings around the topic of suicide prevention and mental health. We provide keynote presentations, different things that we can do. And so the question then becomes, like, how can we bring the face and the voice of a student so that other students feel that this is a safe space to have the dialogue? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, what would it look like? What does it mean to you to include student voices, right? Versus the typical, psychologist who is expected to deliver a talk. You know what I'm saying?
One of the best ways I've seen this done in real life, like in practice, is a panel where students are on the panel, as well as, like, you might have a board certified psychiatrist or something, and then you might have a marriage and family counselor there, or a therapist. And then you have maybe a peer support advocate, and then you have like 2 or 3 students sitting on that panel. These are high school, these are middle school students, and a moderator is asking questions. You get to hear from all sorts of different perspectives. You hear from like a counseling or therapy perspective. You hear from more of like a psychiatry perspective, or like maybe a neuroscience, or like some kind of doctor or researcher. And then you hear from like the lived experience people, and then from youth. Like there are very few things that paint a more robust and comprehensive picture of what behavioral health looks like than actually hearing from each individual perspective all at once answer the same question, rather than like popcorning around, but like ask one question and then each person has 30 seconds to respond and share their thoughts. And by the end of that, 2.5 minutes or however long it takes for everyone to share their perspective, you're like, whoa, I
Yeah.
understand the neuroscience level, and then the counseling or therapy level, and then what it actually feels like individually.
100%. And, even in hearing you share that, there's a lot of intention that must go behind creating an experience like that. You can't just, like I mentioned earlier, do it like it's always been done. There has to be some intention on, okay, what student can we invite to be a part of this? What mental health expert can we invite, and what are we actually trying to get out of this experience for those who attend? And that has to be the focus, right? Because the end goal is supporting the young adults, right? If we're talking about what we're doing on college and university campuses, that has to be the focus. And if it isn't, then what are we really doing? And there has to be intention behind that. So I love that you mentioned that. So my last point in creating these safe spaces is, and you touched on it, but I'd love to hear some more thoughts, right? So creating non-judgmental environment. So a space where you feel safe, you don't feel judged. And that's one way that we can create these safe spaces. Any thoughts on that?
So one of the things that has made me feel comfortable in peer support settings is the feeling of reciprocity. Like one of the coolest things I've ever done, one of the coolest peer support um, scenarios I was ever in, I wasn't even with like a certified recovery peer specialist or anything. It was like nobody was certified. It was like I was going through stuff, the other person was going through stuff. We said it was through NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. We just like broke off into pairs and talked to each other, and I would share what I was going through, and then that person would share what they were going through. So it wasn't one-sided. It
Hmm.
wasn't me sharing and somebody listening and then them trying not to judge me. It was like we were both sharing, and the feeling of reciprocity, like both of us being there for the same reason, that really made it feel non-judgmental.
Hmm.
Like for me to be able to share something knowing full well that they're also going to share something, it immediately leveled the playing field for me.
I love it. Yeah, that's such a good point. It kind of makes me think of like AA meetings, and so I haven't been a part of that, so I don't have personal experience with it. But if everyone is coming to the meeting and everyone has been touched, you know, in the same way, it may not be a specific, the same specific scenario, but just knowing that everyone is here, and they can all speak on this subject, it just, like you said, levels the playing field. So I love that you mentioned that. And that's something that we can do again intentionally, right? There are young adults on campuses throughout the country who are open to being supportive for their peers. They're open to sharing their own story. They're open to being a part of these environments. So how can we take that and use that to implement different programming? So that's a really good point. All right. So I mentioned earlier that I wanted to get in the juicy parts of your story because I heard a little bit of your story, and I was impacted. I think after I heard you speak virtually, it was a Zoom meeting. I hit you up on LinkedIn, and I was like, man, I'd love to chat with you or just hear more and see, what you're up to and learn more about Cope Notes. So I'm excited to have you on the podcast. So I want to start with this question for you, going deeper into your story. Where did you grow up, and what was life like for you as a youngster?
I grew up in Tampa, Florida, in a household that was not safe or comfortable. Um, so life as a child was not the same as a lot of my friends. I was actually exhibiting a lot of symptoms of mental illness at an extremely young age. So this is like pre-kindergarten kind of
Really?
age. I was
Hmm.
self-harming as a toddler. I was hallucinating quite a bit, had serious temper, some pretty pervasive antisocial behaviors. I think by the time I got to middle school, it was to the point where I was no longer able to function normally. So probably by like sixth grade or so, sixth or seventh grade was when it got so disruptive that I almost couldn't function. So there weren't really a lot of let's say this, I feel like I'm getting a second chance at being a kid now.
Hmm.
Like I'm 29 years old and I almost feel like I'm 5, like I'm getting a chance to start over as an
Hmm.
adult now that at least my symptoms are in check enough for me to function and hold relationships and make eye contact and walk up and down stairs and make sandwiches. And there's so many things that I wasn't able to do for so long. So I would say, um, and this is not to be dramatic, it is not to exaggerate. Pretty much until my mid 20s, my life was like absolutely miserable. It was like torture.
Hmm.
So that's why I'm so grateful to be able to do this work. And that's why I'm so vocal about recovery. Cause for years I thought I would never recover. And that was just my lot in life, was abuse and illness. And that was just where I was stuck forever. And it turns out that's not the case.
Wow. I'd love for you to go here if you don't mind. And I've heard you share openly about your experience. What was the lowest point or one of the lowest points for you that you've experienced where you at that point were like, yo, I don't know if I could come back from this?
It's really hard to remember um, any specific point that stands out. There were like tons of them. There
Hmm.
were, I can't count how many days there were where I figured that my life would never get better. And I probably didn't need to stick around any longer to find out because I figured if it was going to get better, it would have by now. So, I mean, I wish I had like a really dramatic example that made for a good story or an anecdote, but really it was almost like this. It wasn't like there were big moments of misery or pain. It was more like a constant round the clock 24/7 type of almost dull misery that I became numb to over time. I know that sounds really bleak, but that's the truth.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
wasn't one or 3 or 6 or 12 big moments. It was like every day, no matter what happened, I just lost a little more hope with each day that passed, no matter what happened during the day.
Hmm. Thank you for sharing that. And I think it's important to hear that too, because there are many people listening to this that have a similar experience where they can't pinpoint, what that experience is like. And I think just you articulating that so well um, helps someone else to feel validated and feel like they're not alone. So I appreciate you sharing that. Um, so I see a guitar in your background. I see some shoes. I see some books. I see the sun. The sun is shining. The weather is sweet. Bob Marley got this song. I can't remember the title. It says, "Sun is shining. The weather is sweet. Make you want to move your dancing feet." And I love that song. I love reggae music. But so I see a couple things in your background, and it makes me curious to know what are some of the things that you use to cope? Like, how do you express yourself? What does that look like for you, especially as you're going through different life transitions?
Yeah, I'll start by saying first, This is very relevant for me because this weekend I had to go into like full self-care, self-soothing mode this past weekend. So I listened to this lecture, I think it was last week, where this guy was saying that he attributed his success in life not to his being smarter than anybody, not to his being more talented than anybody or anything. He said, the only reason I've been successful in my pursuits is because of my ability to self-soothe more consistently and effectively than other people. So
That's
when
good.
he was just saying, when I experience, everyone experiences disappointment, everyone experiences grief and loss and regret and loneliness and all these things that come along with being a person. He said, the only reason I've been successful is because I know how to self-soothe in those times, and I don't waste time. I don't, bury it and hope that it never comes back out, and I don't wallow in it. I go straight into self-soothe mode. So for me, this past weekend, a perfect snapshot is this weekend I wore a new pair of shoes that I had gotten and hadn't put on yet, so they were like nice and clean. I changed the laces on them so it made it feel fresh. I played some guitar. I went to a car show and I saw my dog Pepper, who I don't live with anymore, but I went to visit her, and all four of those things were specific targeted attempts to self-soothe from a very challenging week last week. And I was like, you know what? This weekend, got to get in self-soothe mode. I journaled this week. I got in the pool. I went on a bike ride. Like I have a
You went all
trillion
out.
things in my toolkit. And when I can tell that I'm kind of getting burnt out or feeling distressed or discouraged, I kind of build up my like self-care, self-soothe plan in my head. And I'm like, okay, just wait till Saturday hits, because I'm going in. Like I'm gonna just start hitting all of the hits. And I encourage anybody who's listening, like there's stuff in your life right now that you use to self-soothe, and you might not know that. Like for a long time I didn't know that music was self-soothing. I just thought I liked music. Same with sneakers. I was like, oh, I'm just interested in sneakers. It's like, no, think about it. Like you use that to self-soothe. Think about that. Like lean into it. There are things that might feel like hobbies or interests to you that if you look deep enough, you're like, wow, I do that to self-soothe. And remember that. Keep that in your back pocket.
That's so good. And one thing that I like to share a lot is just my way of developing self-awareness, which is what I hear you kind of speaking on or hinting on, because you have to have the awareness to know what works for you and what tools to keep in your toolbox. So like I ask myself three simple questions like, how are you thinking right now? Or how have you been thinking over the last few days? Like, how have you been feeling? How have you been behaving? And just what is that experience like? And when I can, become present and just check in with myself, my self-awareness, I guess, bucket just expands a little bit more, because then I can see, what's taking me off, what's helping me to be more present, what should I do more of, what should I do less of, so that ultimately I can, achieve whatever goal I'm hoping to achieve. So I think that's really good, and that's something practical that listeners can take with them is, ask yourself a few questions. How am I doing? Am I burning myself out? Right? Like, what are those things that make me feel um, better or help me to relieve stress, self-soothe, like you mentioned, and then taking those tools, either writing them down, throwing it in your phone, so that whenever that moment comes, you can say, okay, let me try this or let me do that. So I love that you share that. I got another question. It has to do with peer support, and I would love to hear what peer support means to you. But right before you jump in, I want to share a quick story. Listeners of this podcast have heard it many times, but it'll be your first time hearing it. So I left home in 2014 to go to college, and I was the first in my family to go off to college. And I grew up in a Jamaican household, two Jamaican immigrant parents, also a Christian family. And unfortunately, we didn't have many conversations about mental health, about emotions, feelings, none of that. So when I moved, from Miami, Florida to Pensacola, and just to give some context, that's about 700 miles away from home. I was on this journey, this adventure of just figuring it out. So working a full-time job, full-time student, trying to go to as many parties and have fun, being a new college student. And I wasn't aware of the stress that can come from all of those things that I was doing. And then the high expectation to succeed, by any means necessary. So went through that period. In my first year, everything came crashing, right? I went from being this motivated, optimistic guy to not being able to get out of bed, like literally didn't have the physical energy, the mental energy to do anything. And I started isolating myself, withdrawing from friends, and just kind of fell off the face of the earth for a little bit. And I had a best friend of mine who recognized what was going on, and she was bold enough to reach out and say, I'm not going to let you stay wherever you at and not say anything. And till this day, I think about that conversation, and I tell people that it not only like changed my life, but that conversation saved my life, because for the first time ever, someone created a safe space for me. And I didn't know what that felt like, or even like what to do with that. And I remember she kept asking me questions. I kept dancing around her questions because I just wasn't used to that. And I finally opened up and I told her everything. I told her how I wasn't sleeping at night because of the negative racing thoughts. I told her how I wasn't eating. I wasn't going to work. I wasn't going to class. I didn't want to do anything. I didn't have any motivation. And then she told me that it sounded like I was depressed. But what I heard was, it sounds like you're making excuses. So long story short, because of the stigma that I had around this conversation, I was like, I can't be depressed. People like me don't get depressed, and people like me don't ask for help. But she told me that, this was a safe space. She didn't use that terminology, but she was like, you can talk to me. There's a counseling center. You can get help. You don't have to do this by yourself. So that led me to finally go to a counselor, which is where I was diagnosed and treated for depression. And that changed my life, because now I'm in this journey of recovery, recognizing that mental health is a real thing. Depression is a real thing. You can actually get help, and you don't have to do it in silence. And when I think about peer support, I think of my best friend who did that for me, right? She literally recognized the signs. She created a safe space. She asked me some questions, and then she pointed me in the direction of support. And that changed the game for me. I'd love to hear from you, Johnny. Like, what does peer support mean to you? And if you have any personal stories or even Cope Notes stories of experiences that you've heard surrounding peer support that you think would be encouraging to the listeners.
When I think of peer support, I think of this is not a clinical definition,
Yeah.
but it's what I think of. I think of two people who get it. That's it. Just two people who get it. Like, I remember I've told people about my suicidal ideation before, and I've had people go, "Whoa, that's like," you can see they're like uncomfortable and they feel weird about it. And I don't mean I go around like dumping this on everybody, but I mean, I've had conversations with people who are like, "Oh, you can tell me whatever." And then I tell them and they're like, "Geez, like, that sounds like a lot. I don't know what to do with that." But then I've also, in a peer support setting through NAMI, I've said to somebody else, I have hallucinated wolves in my home and faces on all of the cabinets in my kitchen, which means that I can't go into my kitchen to eat, which means I go days without eating.
Mm.
And I've had people in a peer support setting go, yup. And I'm like, what do you mean, yup? And they're like, oh, yeah, dude, man, I've hallucinated this and I've seen that, and it's kept me from doing this. And I'm just like, oh, I feel so free right now. Like, I mean, there was something so liberating, because both of us, we didn't have to have that. I think the biggest misconception is that in order to be a peer to somebody, that you need the same lived experience. So like the hallucinations have to be the same, or your profession has to be the same, or no. At least in my opinion, you just need somebody who's not going to treat you like you're crazy for what you're sharing, and has a even a somewhat similar or adjacent, like maybe they've never hallucinated before, but they could say, oh yeah, man, my OCD gets so bad sometimes that I can't go into my kitchen because the cracks in the tile are too small for me to avoid the cracks. So I would just not go in for like a week at a time. And I go, dang, man, that sucks. And he's like, yeah, it does suck. So we didn't even, in that hypothetical scenario, we didn't need to have the same experience to understand each other. That was like the most transformative part of peer support for me, was when I heard people going, yup. And I was like, no freaking way, you know what I'm talking about. And they're like, maybe not exactly, but I know something similar, and that sucks, you know?
That's huge. Oh man, that changes the game for anyone. It goes back to the point of connection. And I think as human beings, that's one thing we're looking for, is like, how do I connect to this person? Like, even listening to your story, I'm thinking about, what are some things that may be similar or that may bridge some sort of connection between us. And you said it great, like that, yup, where it's like, man, this person gets it. I can go deeper with this person. And now I have a safe person. So that's cool. I like it. Let's talk about Cope Notes. Let's talk about Cope Notes. How did Cope Notes start? Like, where did this come from?
I was leaving sticky notes for myself all over my house because I went to school for psychology. I was learning about neuroscience and learning about how the brain basically, so everyone's probably familiar with subliminal messaging, right? Like if you see a message somewhere, even if you don't consciously process it, it still makes an impact on you. And so I was like, man, I wonder if I can like subliminal message my way into interrupting my negative thought patterns and like my anxiety spirals and my depression spirals. Like, I wonder if there's a way to like guerrilla warfare attack those thoughts. And so I would leave sticky notes for myself that had like these pattern interrupt prompts to try to stop myself in my tracks whenever I got there. And I'd put some in my bathroom and in my
Wow.
inside of my shoes. When I went to put my shoes on, I would try to like surprise myself. And it's just like, it's hard to tickle yourself, it is hard to surprise yourself, because I was the person who put the sticky note there. So I wanted to find a way to like surprise myself. I tried setting alarms and all this different stuff, and I was like, shoot, I just want to send unsolicited text messages to my friends with these prompts to see if they make a difference. So nobody asked me to do it. I just started sending messages to people unsolicited of things that I needed to hear, and then people just started texting me back and going, "Whoa, we haven't talked in weeks. How did you know that I needed to hear this, or what was going on in my life?" And I was like, "I didn't know crap about what you were going through. Like, that's your brain doing that. Your brain is magic." And once I started seeing that it was making a positive impact for other people, even people living without diagnoses, I was like, yo, I am onto something, and I need to figure out a way to scale this, because at first I was literally typing the messages into my own phone and
Wow.
texting it to my friends. And I'm like, at some point, I'm going to screw this up so bad if I keep having to do it myself.
I love it. That's so cool. And I think just the thought process of how do I scale this, it just speaks to the type of person you are, like the heart that you have, because you saw firsthand how it was helpful for you, and then you immediately were like, okay, how do I help my immediate friends, and then immediately you're like, how do I help the world, right? And so
Heck
now
yeah.
Cope Notes has grown to where um millions of people have been impacted by these texts that are going out. I
So
love
not
getting.
not millions of people have used Cope Notes yet.
Okay,
So
okay. So
millions
give
of
me give me
people.
some give me some accurate
Yeah.
stats. Yeah,
So millions of people have definitely like heard the story. Like the TED talk that I gave about Cope Notes has over 1 million views. And if you add up like all the keynotes and people who have done the trial and people who've used it through their work and insurance and all those people, definitely. But I'm talking like the number of people who have signed up for Cope Notes right now, as of this recording, is right around 25,000 or so
okay.
people. And we've exchanged about 1.5 million text messages with them so far.
Awesome. I love it. And I love that you mentioned what's going on as of today, because as of this recording, we do have an opportunity for more of you listening to jump on and receive a discount on your Cope Note
Oh,
subscription, which
that's
I'm
right.
going to
Yeah.
share. Yeah, which I'm going to share that information in a little bit so that we can have more users.
Yeah,
And
what the way we measure it is lives impacted. So anytime you use Cope Notes, like, yeah, it's me and 25,000 other people who are in this boat. It's not just, me feeling like I'm the only person in the world who needs help. And also it's not um I'm just some subscriber, I'm just some user of some app. It's like, no, you count as a life impacted. And internally at Cope Notes, like as team members, we celebrate lives impacted. That's what we measure for.
yeah, I love that you share that. So, for those who are listening, tell us what it is like, if someone were to see an interest in subscribing to Cope Notes, what can they expect?
You can expect us to text you when you least expect it. So our whole job, what we do is we send text messages that interrupt negative thought patterns. So you never know when we will text you or what the text will say. It could be an exercise or a journaling prompt or a psychology fact written by peers with lived experience, reviewed by clinicians, and then delivered to your phone at random times. So the whole point is like, we want you to expect to not be able to expect when we text you. That's kind of the point, is like that surprise factor. And then you can journal back to any text message and speak freely to kind of like parse through anything that's going on and vent and boost that emotional IQ, practice some mindfulness. And then you have a digital journal in your Cope Notes text thread that you can scroll back through at any time.
I love it. That's awesome. Thanks for sharing. So we're getting close to wrapping up this episode, and man, this was an amazing conversation. Johnny, I really appreciated you coming on, sharing your story, sharing your thoughts and ideas, and how you've turned your challenge and your life's experiences into something that can impact so many lives. Because I think oftentimes, like when we do, experience challenging situations in our lives, it's the thought process is, how do I get out? How do I get out? How do I get out? But you were like, okay, how do I get out? But how can I help others? Versus just forgetting like it ever happened. And I'm sure you have, days, even till today, where you do struggle, you do have your challenges, and I love that you're open, to sharing that, because it's impacting a lot of people. So I appreciate that, Johnny.
Dude, I think anybody who has experience with some type of hardship, whether you've lost a family member, whether you live with bipolar 2, like whatever it is, if you have experience with that, don't forget that that could be the thing that qualifies you to serve people who know what you're going through. Like, think about it. I've experienced sexual abuse. So what qualifies me to help someone? And by help, I mean sit down and listen to them, talk to
Mm,
them, just have a conversation, provide hope, provide support, whatever. What qualifies me to do that is not that I am a doctor. I don't have sessions. I don't have people come to my office in a therapy setting to have, no, the only thing that qualifies me to go, yup, to somebody is that I've been through it. So please don't lose sight of that. Whatever you've experienced in your own life, people listening, don't forget that that thing, whatever thing has hurt you, whatever thing you feel has held you back, there's someone in the world right now waiting for you to speak up about it so they can say yup to you, and all of a sudden you have a network of people who actually get it.
I love it. I appreciate that. So couple of resources that I want to share with our listeners really quickly. If you are not aware, there was a recent rollout of 988, which is the suicide and crisis lifeline number that anyone experiencing mental health, substance use, or suicide crisis can call or text to get immediate support. So that's 988. Super simple, if you're ever in need of that. Also, for students who are on college and university campuses, most times there's a counseling and psychological services center. Sometimes it's called CAPS, right? So look out for those resources if you ever need support. And then last but not least, we do have a Facebook group. So Unlearn, you can search Unlearn the Lies About Mental Health if you want to keep this conversation going in our Facebook group. Once you request to join, I'll go in and invite you in. You can meet some other advocates and people who want to keep this conversation going. And let's continue, to spread awareness, reduce stigma, and support the well-being of young adults. I did share that we do have a gift for the listeners of this podcast. So Cope Notes, as you have heard from the founder and CEO, Johnny Crowder, is a tool, right, that can be used by anybody. So Speaks to Inspire, super excited to be collaborating with Cope Notes in this way to offer a 10% off discount on your Cope Notes subscription. I'm going to leave the link in our description. You can use the code Speaks to Inspire. That's one word to receive your discount on that. And let's get more users utilizing Cope Notes. And if you know somebody that could benefit from getting the right text at the right time, at the unexpected time, then get that subscription for that person, right? As well. So anything you want to share on that, Johnny, just about, subscribing to Cope Notes and anything else?
Yeah. Great to point out that there's a gift subscription. So I don't know if you're like me when I was younger and I heard about something like this, I'd say, oh, I don't need that. Kind of like you said, oh, people like me don't need that. Like that's for somebody else. If you're one of those people and you have a friend or family member who could benefit from it, you can still use the affiliate code, the discount code that you're talking about to on a gift subscription for somebody else. But also, please don't exclude yourself from trying Cope Notes, because imagine if I was on here saying, we have toothbrushes, and Abraham, you're like, yo, we can give you 10% off your toothbrushes. Imagine someone listening and go, I don't have any cavities. I don't need a toothbrush. Like, bro, yes, you do need a toothbrush. Like, brush those teeth, take good care of your brain. So I encourage you, like, if you're listening to this, you're on the fence, go to copenotes.com, snoop around, watch my first TED Talk. If you search Johnny Crowder on YouTube, you'll find it and learn a little bit more about how Cope Notes works. But please don't think, this is for somebody else. Like, do you think it's an accident that you listened to this hour-long conversation? Like, you probably listened because it was interesting to you. You might as well give it a shot.
I love that. With that being said, Johnny, share with us what's the best way to keep in touch with you to see what you're up to. I know there are a ton of social platforms out there. What are you most on, and how can people connect with you?
I am most active on LinkedIn, which surprises me more than anybody. I never expected that. Facebook, and then on Instagram, I'm at Johnny Crowder Loves You.
And we will have his contact in the description as well. Before we wrap it up, I do want to share one last message from our sponsor. So the Unlearn the Lies About Mental Health podcast is sponsored by Speaks to Inspire, the mental health solution for young adults suffering in silence. Speaks to Inspire is creating safe spaces for students across the nation through comprehensive programs. So learn more about how your campus can benefit from partnering with Speaks to Inspire by visiting www.speaks-inspire.com. With that being said, we would love to see you in the Facebook group. So find us at Unlearn the Lies About Mental Health. And I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you all for tuning in. Take care.